Okay, thank you all for sticking around. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel. I wanted to thank Dan and Ralph for all of their work on this conference and to all of the participants for their wonderful presentations. I'm Meredith Tinhor, and I coordinate the undergraduate history and theory curriculum here at Pratt, and I also have taught in the graduate department, and I also edit an architectural publication called Aggregate, which is up on the screen here for a reason you'll see in a minute. The architecture of neuroscience isn't exactly my topic, but I did spend half my undergraduate years studying neuroscience only to abandon it for critical theory. So perhaps I'm somewhat justified in being here as a moderator of this panel. This question of justification and of interdisciplinarity is in some ways the topic of this final panel, which addresses some of the histories and implications of the commingling of architecture and biological sciences of the mind. In the next two presentations by Deborah Hauptmann and Ed Eigen, we'll hear about pedagogy and learning, history and theory. I wanted, though, before we begin, to just mention that on Aggregate, we just yesterday published this new text, Neurons and Signifiers, by University of Toronto professor Zeynep Çelik-Alexander. And it's a reflection on a conference that took place, I think, exactly a year ago on neuroscience and architecture at the University of Toronto. I can also use this as a moment to tell you guys that we're having another conference that takes mind, brain, psychology, and consciousness and its impact on architecture into account. On April 11th, there's going to be a conference here on architecture and trauma, which might kind of commingle some psychoanalytic and biological perspectives. So anyway, Pratt this spring is, for some reason, a place to think about mind, brain, and architecture. But back to Zeynep Çelik-Alexander's article. She addresses what she sees as a potential neuroscientific turn in architecture, and has critiqued the neuromachinic view of cognition that she sees as too prevalent in architectural applications of neurological theories. Ones that, when adopted fully and without the full complexity that they exist in their own disciplines, does away with culture and with the strange idiosyncrasies of the psychological. Çelik-Alexander launches this critique via Freud's notion of repression, arguing that we need a psychoanalytic concept of repression in order to counter the view of the world that presupposes that it's possible to map cognition and create systems of optimization based on that mapping. So her critique is in some ways a kind of historical predecessor to the one that Michael Eng gave yesterday, as he mentioned the work of the theorists Franco Bifo Berardi, Paolo Verno, Maurizio Lazzaretto, and I'll add Rosi Bredotti to the mix just so it's not all men. All of these theorists explain the dangers of optimized views of the mind that get aligned with the very optimizations of capitalism. So the question is really, is there any way in which neurological research or its applications can in some ways resist that discourse and practice of optimization, which seems so prevalent today? So it's these two worlds of ideas and things, that of 19th century biological research and its psychological correlates, and that of 21st century cultural critique about biopolitics and noopolitics, the politics of life and mind, that this panel will bring together. And I won't say more about Zeynep's text, you guys can read it, but I did want to note in her footnotes that she mentions this conference as evidence of a neuroscientific turn in architecture. But as our day unfolds, I think we can claim that maybe this is a more cautious and tentative gathering, a kind of caution and tentativeness that I'm personally very happy about. Because as the many historical and critical presentations in this conference have made clear, architecture is a site where we can forge interdisciplinary collaborations, but it's also one where we can be critical about the over-application of neurologic discourse in our culture without giving over architectural inquiry and insights fully to neuroscience. So in this panel, I hope we'll gather, I just lost my place. We'll gather more ideas that will help us step out of a reading of what is happening right now in our culture as a neuroscientific turn, and rather to sort of more simply and straightforwardly acknowledge the ways in which biology and architecture have been co-constituted for centuries. So we'll look at the implications and critiques of the commingling of biology and architecture in Deborah Hauptmann's talk. Her computer crashed this morning, so her talk is reconstructed from lost notes. I'm thrilled that she's reconstructing. And then Edward Eigen will address also the same thing in his talk on mollusks, the gust and the landscape in the 19th century. These presentations might lead us towards something that Catherine Ingram suggested yesterday, that we need not so much unpack the ways in which we've misread each other's disciplines, but rather see the slippages and misreadings that happen between architecture and neuroscience as constitutive of knowledge itself. And then we could perhaps use history to clarify some of the relations between architecture and biology today. So that was kind of a long prelude. I should introduce the speakers. Edward Eigen is an architectural historian and scholar who teaches at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Eigen's work focuses on the intersection of human and natural sciences within architecture of the 19th century. He argues that accidents, rather than disrupting the narrative of history, instead provide a thread which connects before and after cause and effect. In looking at a particular case of death by architecture, his lecture will be a primer in how to investigate accidents in the making. And I was particularly happy that Eigen accepted this invitation to join us because he's done so much work on the history of 18th and 19th century biology and the ways that it borrows from and supplies concepts to architecture. Deborah Hauptmann is professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at the College of Design at Iowa State University. Prior to this, she just became the chair in August 2013. She was the director of the Delft School of Design at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. She's a scholar of the philosopher Henry Bergson, but her research also draws on transdisciplinary approaches to architecture, which include disciplines such as philosophy, culture and media studies, the social sciences, and neuroscience. And her book, Cognitive Architecture, From Biopolitics to Neopolitics, Architecture in the Mind in the Age of Information and Communication, which she co-edited with Warren Neidick, who we were talking about a lot yesterday, came out just about 5 years ago, and I think was a pretty crucial text for elaborating a critique of the over-application of the kind of takeaways from neuroscience into a discourse of optimization of the mind. So I'm very excited to have her here in this conference about pedagogy, both because she's been someone who's been deeply engaged with the ideas of neuroscience, but also because she's leading a design school, in some ways based on that research. So without further ado, I will welcome her to the podium.
Hello. Thank you, Meredith, for the introduction. And yes, it's true. I've been sitting here today reconstructing, and so you're going to get some fragments. My IT guy this morning got my computer back up, but only from a week ago, and so I had some stuff available. But I appreciate you listening and following me through the fragments you're about to receive. So the one thing about starting again this morning was I was reflecting on things that were discussed yesterday. And so before I get into the issues of cognitive architecture, I'm going to start a bit with some of the things we were talking about yesterday. So, empirical psychology. Precursors. We were talking about where does neuroscience begin, or where does the discussion of architecture in relation to things like psychology, et cetera, begin. And of course, is Professor Mulgrave? Yeah, there he is. Has had a lot of work in this area and done much. I'll conclude this section of my talk where he kind of left off with that today with a very small comment about Wolflin. Anyway, so I believe the theoretical discourse on sense, perception, and affect in architecture can be traced directly to two main streams of scientific, philosophical work from the end of the 19th century. The first is the discussion on the relation of descriptive and genetic psychology in the work of Bretonneau, Husserl, and ultimately Freud. And the second is an aesthetic discourse which concentrated on the problem of founding a psychological account of experience of architecture, which moved away from the Hegelian and the Kantian inheritance of German aesthetic discussion and more to the empirical and ultimately phenomenological base, Within the discipline of aesthetics itself, a subdiscipline of philosophy from the second decade of the 18th century, due primarily to the work of Baumgarten and Burke, the main direction had been established as a science of the sensible, and in Burke, a genetic investigation into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. which he wrote through what Kant, in his third critique, refers to as a masterful and nuanced psychological account. Burke tries to get from the genetic via the descriptive, and the late 19th century German theorist takes up the challenge by a rigorous partition of descriptive and genetic psychology. This can be seen as paralleled in the debate between the advocates of Semper and those of Riegel, again, Professor Malgrave, on the evolution in place of material culture and forms. In Semper, this follows a strict evolutionary, historical, and social path, and in Riegel belongs to a free, productive, artistic will. Subsequently, the abandonment of Hegelian notion of the idea and the Kantian reflection on the power of judgment was forced by a development of a new empiricism in German research, which can be traced through Ernst Mach, Franz Bertano, and William Dilthey, at Edmund Husserl, of course. Between 1884 and 1886, Bertano delivered his first lectures on descriptive psychology and the task of genetic psychology, 1884 and 1886, where he described his work as the discovery of the condition of the coming into being of psychological processes, which he saw as necessarily connected with psychological investigation. Roughly speaking, sensation in the bodily experience is the source of all ideas or concepts. In other words, there are no innate ideas. All concepts can be derived from experience. The task of descriptive psychology would be to analyze concepts and show from what experiences they had derived. German aesthetic theory would subsequently come to be held generally under the disciplinary field of empirical psychology. It developed various approaches to the manner in which aesthetic object is apprehended by both mind and body. For instance, through such concepts as kinesthetic perception. Every architect in the room and architecture history theory person will know these concepts. Kinesthetic perception, a critique of perception based on the movement of the eye, primarily following Hildebrand, and the the physiology of sensorial perceptions, held under terms such as feeling, mood, empathy, which we heard about a little earlier, following, of course, Robert Fischer. I'm going to run just through a few slides. A few of the things we talked about today. I was trying to put things together that would touch on things we had discussed. So the issue of how we relate to a form that is not traditionally architecture, right? So how do we understand a Mobius strip or Greg Lynn's blobs and these types of forms when we have no bodily relation to them? And I think I would argue that that's just simply not true. If you think of design and not just architecture, you understand that for many, many, many years now, we have been holding and dealing and handling design objects of industrial design that are in fact curvilinear, amorphic, and very fluid. And I think that the same discussion we have on drawing, the importance of the pen in the hand as it touches the paper, the materiality of that bodily experience, I think we were there some time ago. And here is just an example, really. I mean, if you look at the Eames chair. And then this is, of course, Hadid's installation at the Biennale from 2012, in fact, so just after Phillips. So that's an example. Here's another one. This one is a little less obvious, and I do this because we've been talking so much about Mies in this kind of negative way, and I want to, not a negative way, I mean, he's a fantastic architect, but I want to touch on this notion of, how we might see his Friedrichstrasse projects as these amazing objects of sensation, right? Because what I'm really interested in is sensation and the sensorium and experience and how this affects our thinking and being as architects. So I put this slide up, but what I'd like you to look at, yeah, you can barely see it. In the left lower corner of the screen, you can also see, of course, this is, and some of you will know this slide, you can see that this is Friedrichstrasse, right? It's the street in perspective. And down midway through the street, you see a bridge. I mean, everyone see that? So, of course, this is the other side. And here's where I think it becomes incredibly interesting. And we have, of course, on the other side, George Gross's drawing of Friedrichstrasse, and what that actual kind of experience and movement and chaos and motion is all about. And for some reason, in this 19th century moment, I somehow don't find Mises' Friedrichstrasse so unusual. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But there's something about the speed and the motion, and it is drawing you upwards, but it still somehow belongs to the chaos and the moment and the fracture of that city, for me. All right. So, in political science, there's a negative critique of neoliberal capitalism. And again, there are going to be a few fragments. No, excuse me, I shouldn't have gone to this slide, I'm backing up. In the 19th century, this was about bridging the sensual into aesthetics, combining immediate feeling with responsive feeling. This questioned how particular forms aroused particular responsive feelings, depending on the conformity of forms to design and the function of the muscle and the body. From those of the eyes to our limbs and to our bodily postures as well. This follows a similar principle to kinesthetic experience, however, it includes the entire sensory motor apparatus. So, in political science, there's a negative critique of this neoliberal capitalism that effectively destroys community with the cult of the individual. Now, you'll see why these are connected. In terms of mirror neurons, in fact, it suggests that capitalism reconfigures. Now, that could be wrong, right? But this is the theoretical position. It suggests that capitalism reconfigures our neural networks by reprogramming our drive or lack thereof for empathetic behavior. And I think this is really an interesting point. Let me see if I can get this going. I have a few very short. Do you guys know this car? It's the BMW Gina. Yeah, it's a very short. I could have given you a very long film. Does everyone know this car? Right, it's an exoskeleton covered with a fabric, a membrane, right? And the membrane is movable and pliable. So the hood of the car opens up like a rib cage, right? It's a fascinating kind of, car as biological organism. I would normally conclude here with a talk about Wolfland, but again, Professor Mulgrave did that already. So the only thing I want to say is, for me, Wolfland and the work you referred to, I believe this can be seen as the first vitalist architecture. I think you were touching that beautifully, and I appreciate that. But I'll move on. I had a section on phenomenology, which I'm going to skip. I was doing that because of the talk yesterday. But I do want to point out one little thing, because I think it's fairly pertinent to some of the discussion that goes on today when we set ourselves up as the hard scientists, the positivist, the rigorous thinkers against the non. I just want to put this point. We all know the birth of phenomenology with Edmund Husserl. I think we talked about that yesterday. And I just want to say this, we have Husserl as the founder of phenomenology. Some of you will know this, some of you will not. Husserl started a petition against, this is a 1912 petition, against allowing Ernst Mach to join the faculty of philosophy, because he was a psychologist. Ernst Mach was a psychologist who wanted to correlate sensation with associated nerve processes, right? And for Husserl, this was just positivist nonsense. He was a pretty powerful guy. It took Heidegger to take him down, of course. But anyway, I just threw that out. All right. All right, this quote is up there for no other reason than I couldn't figure out how to fit it nicely in the talk. I'm not going to talk about plasticity because there's not time, so I just kind of stuck this here and I'm going to let it float. So I'm now on to cognitive architecture. So cognitive architecture, as Meredith just said, was a volume we put out in 2010, started in a conference called Architecture and Mind. so very similar. In 2008 at Delft, we held this conference in the fall right after the building had burnt to the ground. So we had just been kind of moved into this 19th century building that wasn't working very well yet. It was a wonderful event, and it almost turned into kind of an experts meeting because so few students could find the auditorium. It was really a crazy moment. I don't know, some of you may remember in 2008 of May, the TU Delft burnt to the ground. But anyway, so it started with that, and then a few years later, we decided to, well, we started working immediately on the volume. The volume is not proceedings. We had very few speakers. The volume is anything but few. And we really worked to get it to the size it is, and it's a brick. You could use it as a weapon or a doorstop pretty easily. So, cognitive architecture. It developed from the belief that the world of culture and cultural artifacts, whether material or immaterial, reconfigures our brain. We are speaking directly of the matter that makes up the human sociocultural environment, music, architecture, art, design, media, language, as well as political, social, and cultural institutions. Within a neuroscience perspective, or at least our neuroscience perspective, it is fairly straightforward. Environment-induced neural activation shapes brain development to be consistent with the largely human-made environment. Right? This is also what two neuroscientists, Steve Quartz and Terry Zinowski, introduced in 1997. I think there was quite a bit of talk about Jerry Edelman, right, who's a contemporary here. I won't do that. But 1997, for me, a crucial piece of writing, which was a paper on neural constructivism. It's in the book. In cognitive architecture, we suggested that if fields related to cultural theory wish to approach the contemporary world, populated as it is by technologies of information and communication, as well as the internet techno-bred minds of this generation, then the traditional reliance on thinking the problem of power and power relations needs to be expanded from the bios to the nous. I realize I've got this floating Quartz and Sinowski quote in here, and I'm hoping like hell I got it back in the paper later, but it was a morning's effort. All right, I'm going to keep going. Cutting and pasting. All right. So from biopolitics, from the biological to the nos. I say new, and everyone thinks I'm saying you. But anyway, generally speaking, bios acts on the body or populations of body, inscribing habits and practices specific to life. Michel Foucault's critique of disciplinary society in the form of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon well illustrates this. While nous operates on mind, on general intellect and mental disposition, in other words, the power exerted over the life of the mind, including perception, memory, and attention. Perception, memory, and attention is something that everyone at this, everyone speaking cares very much about. Deleuze suggests that in control societies, the apparatus or dispositifs of power and control that once operated primarily on the body now operate on the mind through technologies of communication. Central to this thesis is Maurizio Lazzarato's concept of action at a distance, 2006 paper, The Concept of Life and Living in Societies of Control. Here he outlines the continuation of the disciplinary societies of Foucault into societies of control as discussed in Deleuze's Postscripts on the Societies of Control from 1990. Lazzarato draws a distinction between life as memory and life as a set of biological characteristics, death, birth, disease, etc. In other words, we should distinguish the bio contained in memory, and to avoid confusion, give it another name, which he identifies as noopolitic. Noopolitics, the ensemble of techniques of control, is exercised on the brain. It involves, above all, attention and is aimed at the control of memory and its virtual power. Following Gabriel Tard, Lazzarato argues that media provide the conditions of the action at a distance of one mind on another through the brain's power to affect and become affected. It's pretty straightforward, which is mediated, of course, and enriched by technology. These issues act on memory and attention, but I won't have time to get to memory and attention. So I'm going to move to what we referred to in the book as the new or the neuro-sensorium. And I'm doing this today because I think this is particularly important to what we're lamenting in architecture when we talk about the loss of the tactile or the haptic or the hand or the, and so this is the reason I selected this just for today. So today we see the idea of empathy being discussed in terms of mirror neurons. Of course, vision here is understood as multimodal, as a multimodal enterprise encompassing the activation of sensory motor, viscera motor, and affect-related brain circuits. Here we are no longer dealing with the sensorium as the sum of perception seated in sensation and focused on space or the relation to objects. We were seeing some of that discussion earlier in the wayfinding. It's absolutely true, but I'm talking about a different kind of sensorium, visual or haptic, nor on traditional modes of aesthetic representation. In this discussion, time becomes the horizon on which contours of perception, experience, memory, and sensation are traced. And time is not linear in this sense. It is not extensive, it is intensive, and it is complex. Time technologies as apparatuses of social machines reconstitute sensibilia through both affective and intellectual processes. We heard Jacques Rancière referred to yesterday in Mr. Ng's talk, the redistribution of the sensible. Similarly, Jacques Rancière, in writing on what he termed the distribution of the sensible, has argued that politics and art construct material rearrangements of signs and images, producing real effects that define variations of sensible intensities, perceptions, and the abilities of bodies. I was citing Rancière. This returns to that slide I had holding a moment ago, the saison, sensations are the basis of my business. I believe that I'm impenetrable. There's a whole story at dinner about that citation and the myth of that citation. So, how many of you guys remember David Cronenberg's 1995 film Existence? Yeah. Existence mapped new technologies of information and communication upon biotechnologies, giving us a futuristic projection of an intensive virtuality immersed in a fully sensorial environment. Right. This is the film with early Jude Law, and I love her. What is her name? But anyway, this is the one where literally in their spinal cord they kind of inserted this biological machine made of cells and organisms and organic matter. This novum, in which the human psyche interfaces with bioelectronic devices, is, as one theorist puts it, a sort of analog to Freud's notion of drive, conceived as an entity bridging the mental and the somatic, the interface of mind and body, and producing, in fact, psychic reality. If existence can be seen as an example of a cultural bioimaginary, and this is how I see it, a bioimaginary, taking its impetus from the virtual models, gaming, play, much of what we have seen over the last 2 days, then the more recent example would be Christopher Nolan's 2010 film Inception, which was also mentioned yesterday. Inception exemplifies the current no-imaginary, projecting a new form of corporate espionage, and thus situates directly within cognitive capitalism. I'll do this one real quick. I think has everyone seen this movie as well?
I guess I thought that
But
the
listen
dream
to
space would be all about the visual, but it's more about the feel of it. My question is, what happens when you start messing with the physics of it all?
I believe the capacity of art and design to generate new modes of perception and action, new relations, experiences, and networks of temporalities is crucial today. Her line was, you would think it would be more about vision, but in fact it's more about feeling, right? That's really fantastic. You'd think it'd be more about vision. What I'm getting at here in relation to image is that the new sensorium is generated by, among other things, the cultural imaginary, the collection, compilation, collage of images which we construct, stitch together, invent, envision, with which we envision our world. I had a section on how brain got language, but that one's coming out. I do love this, though. The brain has language readiness, right? This was a comment out of Michael's book. He did this quite a bit. The brain has language readiness, complex action, recognition, and imitation, right? I think we don't realize how important the act of recognition is. I mean, the question has come up several times without explicitly being said, the question of how the new emerges. I think yesterday we actually talked about it briefly. Anyway, so I know I'm rushed on time. Where am I? Do I have minutes? Do I have? Okay, perfect. So I show this slide because, and I won't go much into Bruce Wexler. Bruce Wexler is a neuropsychiatrist from Yale University who wrote a beautiful book on culture and brain. And Bruce, of course, he talks about, Bruce's main story is the longue durée, right, the deep history. You know, he would talk about how the brain changes over generations and generations and generations. You know, it's a beautiful kind of slow evolution. And this image gets him very excited because, you know, he'll say, look, you can see it. You can actually see it with the naked eye. And of course, I don't need to explain what you're looking at, I don't believe. And if I did, I would invite one of our esteemed guests in the room who could explain it better than I to do so. But you guys do see the difference between the use of the right and the left hand versus the difference in the use of the right and the left hand in the string player and the symmetrical action of the right and left hand in the piano player. Bruce says, the fundamental difference between human brain and that of other animals, among others, is the greater extent to which the human brain's development and structure is influenced by sensory input. So this leads us to individuality, or individual brains, and at the level of synaptic microstructure, no two brains are identical, and any single brain is continuously changed by its environment and experience. Continuously might be an exaggeration. Research in molecular neurobiology, discovery of the mechanisms of synaptic plasticity, which many of you I mentioned, regarded as the cellular basis of such global brain functions as learning, memory, motor learning, the cortical mechanism in perception, and so on. It feels really silly talking about this stuff after what we've heard in the last few days. So, effects of digital architecture on our brains, a space that has the power to provoke new organs of perception and new possibilities of thought. I don't want to talk about, I'll be happy to answer a question from a student about, you know, tools and developing things like, you know, all the software skills we need to all the software programs you need to know to go into an office, Revit, et cetera. But this is a different discussion. So, perception. I'm gonna very quickly follow up with the issue of mapping, or the ability to wayfind. Jameson's critique of the Bonaventure Hotel, and Frederick Jameson, this is, for those of you who know it, of course, it's the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. It's a very, very famous critique. I mean, many people will know this critique. But what Jameson says that's interesting is we do not yet possess a perceptual apparatus to process this new type of hyperspace. Our perceptual habits were formed in the older kind of space, that which I've called the space of high modernism. So his argument is, of course, that someday people will be able to navigate this space that we cannot navigate today. I think that's already happened. And then, of course, we have the beautiful quote from Benjamin. Catherine referred to the latter half of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction yesterday when she was talking about how we acquire architecture through haptic sensation. But of course, the first part of the paper claims during long periods of history, the mode of human sense perception changes with humanity's entire mode of existence. The manner in which human sense perception is organized, the medium in which it is accomplished, is determined not only by nature but by historical circumstances as well. So, this is just a holding slide for me. Architecture, computational programs, and systems. This is the area that we most often place against the hand of the architect. We are in the situation where we lament it as the loss. I mean, every generation goes through the loss, what we did when we studied, what we believe. And I think there is some truth to the loss and other things that we have to engage more critically. So, now I'm rushing. I'm going to very quickly. Exogram and n-gram systems in neuropsychology. High distributed networks, to use typical terms, intensive, nonlinear, self-organizing, etc. The n-gram memory system is internal. It includes motor skills, driving, playing the piano, etc. Emotional responses such as fear, anxiety, etc., etc. It's perceptual learning, categories of form recognition, whether animal or parabolic architecture, right? I mean, either way. Language is abstracted code relating to an episodic relating to personal life. Exogram, monuments, totems, tokens, coins, records, written or symbolic, mathematical and musical notation, architectural nomenclature, drawings, instruments, photographic, moving images, et cetera, et cetera. So, what interests me about this is there's a discussion about these two systems when they reach parity. And the issue of parity has many problems. Again, this is a topic others in this room could discuss much better than I can. One of the main problems is that the idea that when the two systems reach parity, they also generate homogeneity. Again, how can the new emerge? But the way I like to think about it, this is an alternative way, I like to think about one system being a memory prosthetic for the other. Now, not because of the issues you were talking about in reality, of your patients and the people we are serving in this sense, but I think of the memory prosthetic as the network of influences and knowledge and data that every student in my college, every student I work with is embedded in, right? These are techno-bred minds. That term people use, something generation, not tech generation. There's a generational gap between those that were born with technology and the rest of us that were not. I think it's an understatement, which is why I can't remember the term, right? I think it's meaningless. I think these are techno-bred minds. I think we can barely begin to fathom what they are capable of. So, the memory prosthetic is what is interesting to me about thinking through this model in neuroscience, neuropsychology of the n-gram and the exogram. So I'm going to jump now. There was a discussion that we received as speakers, and I couldn't quite figure it out, but it was a discussion about the hand of the architecture, and it appeared to be a discussion between Dan and Michael. Is that correct? There were questions, and yeah. So basically the question about architecture educators. And one of the issues that was raised was team-based learning, right? So how do these new schemas, how do these new ways of seeing and thinking change team-based learning? Does it imply a process across skills that are critical to cognition, innovation? I'm reading from the script, during the design process. How does this relate to today's transdisciplinary team-based model as opposed to the individual artist, right? The individual, the production of the individual, the high capitalist destruction of empathy with the production of the hyper-individual. So team-based model, and I'm wrapping this up. Attention, split distributed attention, where the user of digital technology has learned to negotiate and navigate super fluidity of sources and stimuli and data through fast oscillations of consciousness. Yesterday we saw something about the ability to grasp multiple images in a glance, right? So, access. Systems and networks of action and attention, not merely disciplinary, but transdisciplinary, which is more concerned with the framing of questions or our ability to see when the confines of the discipline, bio or new, are removed. This is about something other, something more. Team-based pedagogy models, the team is a multiplicity. It is extensive, discrete, it has extensive and discrete members, and it is intensive. It is virtually networked in a cognitive stream, right? This is cognitive capitalism at its base. It is a regime of knowledge. It includes digital programs, systems which are both operated by and operated on by the members of the team, if we can call it a team. I even hesitate to use the term members, because it's no longer a collection of individuals, but a plurality of what Deleuze would call dividuals. More akin to an organism, not a body without organs, which is a body without organization, but an organism with hyper-organization, in fact. So back to the external world, being memory prosthetic, this is how I see the system in which our students today are operating in. And I think I'm going to finish right now, I know. We've been talking about architecture and the brain, architecture and neuroscience, and I think what we're trying to decide how to teach our students, and I think that all these old people standing up telling you about these things, I think what we have to do is very quickly figure out how to learn from our students, because what they are capable of doing in this dispersed and intensive network is something that we can't even fathom. And so that's where I would take the discussion about how it changes pedagogy today. Thank you. Thank you.